The New York Times published a crossword puzzle on the first day of Hanukkah that many believe looks like the silhouette of a swastika. Now, we're gonna show it to you so you can judge for yourselves. The real question here is whether you see the swastika, number one, but number two, whether the New York Times, of all places, intentionally published a crossword puzzle that looks like a swastika on the first day of Hanukkah.
Okay, well, all right, so let's break this down. The New York Post story that I read on it, understandably is biased because they hate the New York Times. The New York Post is right wing, and the New York Times they think is left wing. In reality, of course, the New York Times is not left wing. They're mainly corporate media. And then almost all the people that were outraged by this were right wingers. And the first guy who wrote about, can't believe this happened on the first day of Hanukkah. And I'm like, oh, maybe it's like maybe the Anti-Defamation League and they were concerned or something. No, it's Don Jr. Like as if he cares and that he's actually outraged. And he's like, if this was in a right-wing publication, would you give us the benefit of the doubt? Well, then I'm not giving you the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, let me give you his exact tweet. He says, disgusting. Oh, because I'm sure he's disgusted with potential anti-Semitism. Only the New York Times would get Hanukkah going with this. With this is the crossword puzzle. Imagine
that sentence is a crossword puzzle.
Totally. Imagine what they would do to someone who did this and was not ideologically aligned with them. I'll give them the same benefit of the doubt they would give those people exactly zero. Look, I don't really care what anyone's saying about it. They didn't intentionally do anything. Okay, it was a mishap. I don't think, unfortunate to say the least. I do see it, but I don't think anyone intentionally did anything.
So look, there's only two possibilities. One is that apparently this happens every once in a while. It's a coincidence because they got accused of the same thing in 2014 and 2017, meaning that, hey, if you take a series of black squares and white squares and you go through thousands and thousands and thousands of permutations, every once in a while you get something that kind of looks like that and then people get mad, right? That's the most likely explanation. The second possibility is maybe the guy who designed it kind of put it in as a horrible Easter egg, right? And the editors didn't catch it, etc. You'd have to talk to that guy. I doubt it, but maybe it's at least theoretically possible, right? But did the New York Times do it on purpose? The Sulzberger family owns the New York Times. I mean, look, I think the publisher is now Catholic or something along those lines, but it's a famous Jewish family from New York. They get accused of being the Jewish media, that secretly controls everything by idiots like Kanye West and Fuentes, etc. Now they're being accused of being pro-Nazi? That doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, look, I don't care who owns the New York Times, who's behind the New York Times. I mean, it would be relevant if the individuals who have power at the New York Times had a history, for instance, of anti-Semitism or discrimination or hatred. But as far as we know, we haven't seen any proof of that, any example of that. And so, look, the point that I want to make is, I know that we are living in this era where the order of operation is to automatically assume the worst of people and automatically assume that people intend the worst things through their actions, right? I would like to actually take a step back and look at the body of work or the history of a publication, an individual, whoever is in question, to actually determine whether or not they intentionally did something bad. And in this case, I don't know, I just don't see the New York Times as a publication that has a history of anti-Semitism.
No, it's absurd. It has no such thing at all. And then the right wingers are saying, well, the New York Times is notoriously anti-Israel.
What?
On which planet? On which planet? In their version of being anti-Israel, it means that in every story, they don't necessarily assume that the Palestinians are non-human.
No, what they're
like in
referring
some of the stories, they refer to them as human beings.
Yeah, and the other thing is, if you dare to criticize a politician in the Israeli government, right? That gets, because anti-Semitism, that word gets weaponized in order to silence people who disagree with what a particular government is doing. Criticism toward a government is not anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitic statements is anti-Semitism, right? If you're saying things that Kanye said, for instance, clearly anti-Semitic. Being critical of Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't default make you an anti-Semitic person.
If you thought Dick Cheney's policies were terrible, that doesn't make you anti-American. If you think Netanyahu's policies are terrible, it doesn't make you anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. So the guys that are pushing these arguments are obviously acting in bad faith. I'm sure that some people saw it and they don't know the whole history and they're like, whoa, that does kind of look like it. So not all those folks are acting in bad faith, but the ones that are pushing it out, all the right wingers go, oh, it's definitely a swastika. Only the New York Times would do this. No, almost all of your publications would do it, and they do it on purpose. And then when he's like, why would I give you the benefit of the doubt when you don't give us the benefit of the doubt? Well, I'm not gonna give the Daily Stormer the benefit of the doubt when they're a Nazi website. Context might matter. I'm gonna give the New York Times benefit of the doubt on this because they have no history of being anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. Whereas if you said, hey, the New York Times, I'm skeptical of their intentions because of how they treat corporate stories, and then you give me a dozen examples of how they have pro-corporate positions and say that anything that helps the average American is a radical leftist. Yeah, they have a deep history of doing that. Okay, that's a legitimate criticism that you can show with evidence. They're like, oh, why don't we get the benefit of the doubt? Because of what you do all the time. And then, yeah, that's it.
I'm just sick of everybody. That's where I'm at.
Look, that's where Anna's at.
Yeah.
I'm
just sick of this environment of expecting the worst of people, automatically assuming the worst of people, ignoring the body of work that anyone has ever done, and just judging them based on one moment in their lives where they might have made a mistake. That's the era we're living in. And I hate it. I can't stand it. I'm over it. And I wish people would get past it at this point.
Well, Anna, that brings us to the final irony here. Because the New York Times smeared me. And they pretended I was anti-Muslim when I'm actually from a Muslim background. And they brazenly lied about me. And what did they do? They picked 4 or 5 things out of a 20-year career and things that had already even been deleted 15 years in the past and pretended that I was all the racist, sexist, etc. They smeared me to no end. It was the most deceptive, awful thing I've ever seen, okay? And I witnessed it personally. But wait a minute, here I am defending the New York Times. Why? Because I don't want to be like them. I want to give you the full context. You need the context of a story. What the New York Times should have said is, maybe Cenk said 4 things wrong out of 60,000 videos, but he's known as a progressive activist and fighter, right? Someone who fights for these policies. Instead, they were like, him and Bernie Sanders. Can you believe how racist and sexist they are because of how we're gonna smear them? The New York Times was terrible in doing that. And they should fix themselves because they have a massive anti-left, anti-progressive, pro-corporate bias, okay? But that doesn't mean that we should do the same things that they do. We give you the proper context, and here we are defending the New York Times because our job is to actually be fair.